In today's episode, we will be talking about Camaieu underpaintings and glazing. The Camaieu and underpainting. Cistercian monasteries in France reformed towards ascetic values in 1134, resulting in a prohibition of color in religious art. This resulted in Camaieu images. A Camaieu is a lean, monochromatic, fully rendered, high-key tint painting originally applied to stained glass and later used as an underpainting technique. Depending on the color, a Camaieu is called a grisaille, a verdi, bruni. This is also bruni. And this is also bruni. Or cirage. Grisaille can be painted in burnt umber, transparent, zinc white, opaque, as all whites are opaque, but zinc white is the best white for mixing, and ultramarine blue, also transparent. You can also use a tube of lamp black. Verdi can be painted in ultramarine blue, zinc white, and a cadmium yellow. And then bruni is painted in burnt umber and zinc white. In the grisaille, the colors result in a grayscale. Verdi is painted in green, but unlike other Camaieu tint paintings, it shows more range in hue. Verdi can be created from zinc white, cadmium yellow, and ultramarine blue. So you have more options for your warms and cools. Bruni can be better for communicating a difference in temperature. So it's really great for portraits. Bruni can be warm or cool depending on how thin it is. Cirage is painted in a yellow tint, and the word translates to wax or polish in French. In any hue, use a lean, transparent Series 1 or 2 paint, and save the more expensive paints for the final layer. Zinc white is also a Series 1. Ultramarine is also a Series 1. The same is true of burnt umber, that is a Series 1. And so is cadmium yellow. They're all Series 1 colors. Okay. So the undermost layer of the painting should dry the most quickly, or it is presumed it may cause cracks and possibly flaking. To extract some of the oil from the paint, you can squeeze it onto a piece of newsprint from the tube. And once the appropriate amount of oil has been drawn out, you can use a palette knife to transfer it onto the palette. So this looks like it has lost some oil here. Leaving the squeezed paint on the newsprint for too long will separate the structure of the paint and binder. The linseed oil and turpentine varnish many artists use and add to the top layer of a painting protects the paint not only from physical damage like a scratch, but also from chemical reactions between oil pigment and the oil and the pigment, which otherwise inhibit the intention of the artist's original color survival. Understand that the pigments that create the color in the paint tend to settle deeper than the oil, and so pigments can get lost behind layers of yellowing linseed oil as the paint cures from a solid to a solid film over hundreds of years. This dull effect is called dead color. Removing varnish from the surface of a painting with solvent such as turpentine can reduce the amount of cured yellowing oil on the surface, and a new layer of varnish can be applied for continued conservation. So here, from my manual, is a Siraj painting, and here's the wax. Colors change their effect based on their strata placement. A darker color over a light color is very different from a lighter color over a darker one. As an example, use a soft brush. Take the wax off of your tip if you store yours with wax on it. Ah, so clean and perfect when you wash and wax your brushes. Okay, and let's look at some of these things. So I'm putting directly onto my palette some linseed stand oil. This is the medium that I will use to make the glaze. Okay, and I want it to dry a little bit more quickly than subsequent and later layers. Sorry, just drying more quickly than later layers. So I'm also going to use a little bit of this cobalt dryer, just a touch. It's very runny. That will be my glazing medium, cobalt dryer, and linseed stand oil. And I'm putting a little blue in that medium, and you can see it's very transparent. And the more that you add, the more intense or diluted your color is. So when you layer blue over blue, the blue becomes more intense. But you don't lose things like texture underneath of the glazing. You can still see all of the rendering that you did. You see how the space between these two different hues is perfectly preserved even after you glaze. And the amount of a glaze that you push into a surface can be varied. You can make a gradient with it, and you can also scratch back into it. This is a really useful trick for rendering fur or hair in an oil painting. So if you put red over red, it would become a darker and more intense red like this. But if you put a red over blue, it wouldn't necessarily look the same as blue over red. As you mix colors, be aware that the way they look adjacent to colors on your painted surface will look different from the way they look on your palette. So hold your palette or your palette knife up to your painting so that you can compare colors as you mix. Up next to your painting and also up next to the observed subject or object. As you layer glazes of color, you can spray a Damar varnish over the dry to the touch layer. So it looks wet because it's an oil glaze, but it's actually dry to the touch. And oil paintings don't really dry, they just cure. They just become solid. Okay. You can spray the Damar varnish on those dry to the touch areas, and then you can layer another coat of glaze over that. And if you don't like the way it looks, you can wipe it off. But Damar varnish is an oil medium, so be advantageous of the strata placement when using the spray. You want to begin by introducing highly chromatic colors to focal points. So in this Brunei underpainting, the only place I put any color in glaze is here on the stalks of the tulips. So you want to use thin layers of very chromatic paint, and paint is always the most chromatic when it's first come out of the tube before it's blended with other colors. So right from the tube, add a thin layer of highly chromatic paint to your focal point. The more thinned out it is, the more light is reflected from the canvas through the paint pigments as possible. So go for an intensity of chroma, because this can always be toned down with later glaze layers, but it is really challenging to restore intense chroma in layers. So rags and other experimental tools will have different effects on when it comes to dispersing the pigment, whether feathering or blending. So the use of either turpentine or oil medium for these kinds of effect is determined by the fat over lean strata. Okay. So apply the glaze, the oily glaze, mostly to the foreground. Allow the paint in the background to settle into the canvas. It will become less dimensional and reflective, thereby enhancing its recession. Placing a blanket of cool tones over more distant planes will unify them in a space, just as warmer tones on nearer planes will cause them to advance. Blanketing too much space will visually lump the planes together and lose the receding gradient of space, ultimately flattening the spaces and forms once again. So this can be used well when a multicolored object such as a bouquet in a still life or a garden in a landscape need to be united. If you have like a rose bush or actually a really multicolored bouquet and you want the whole, you want groups of it to look united, like groups of flowers in it, you can blanket them with a uniting tint or tone. Tint is when colors are mixed with white or a lighter hue, and tone is when they are mixed with black or a darker hue. So tint is just higher value color and tone is lower value color. So you can use a tint or a tone to unify groups visually. But if you cover like too much space, like all of this is the same kind of green, and it actually ends up flattening it. If I put a glaze on select things in the front, it's going to look like a group in the front. Okay, so form can be enhanced by rendering ambient occlusion. allow distant edges and contours of objects to take on similar qualities to tie them to the ground. So if we look at this Faraday again, it's helpful to just lose some areas to the darkness, because from a distance they seem to make sense, and as you get closer and they become blurrier, it's just that some things are lost, like where is his other shoulder, where does his neck end, and what happens here in this part of the painting. Okay, so allow the edges to sort of dissipate. And you can use like a stippling kind of effect, like between your background and the object that you're trying to tie into it, and it will pull the object visually back towards the other plane. So objects in the foreground and focal point can be blocked in with an intense midtone, and then while the paint is still wet, form can be painted a la prima or wet on wet without losing the unity of the object. Okay, so let's do a little bit. So I'm mixing a little cadmium yellow with ultramarine blue to get this, and my oil medium with dryer. I'm getting this green tone, and I'm gonna paint some of these leaves in to unite them as one object or one body. And we'll share some of that with these as well. And I'll also push the I'm going to push some of them back with ultramarine blue and the raw umber. Okay. So I've made a color that's a little more dull and dark, and I'm going to push some of these back in space. I used the raw umber because I want to help tie them into the background a little more. And if you are working on the glazed layers, you don't need to take as much oil out of the paint or any oil out of the paint, because you're now at a layer where you are including the oily mediums. So we'll push some of these back, and you can see that you can paint right over objects in the painting without losing the information, which makes the shadows. Okay, sorry about that. Batteries died right in the middle of that. Okay, so I used a little bit of the raw umber, which is the basis of the Brunei underpainting hue, and therefore is present throughout the painting in the green that I'm applying to these bits of flower and stalk that are further away in the painting. Again, without actually losing the information from the Brunei underpainting. Okay. And then I want to tie this vase back in space more. So I'm using pretty much purely the Brunei raw umber color right now to just do that. Soften these edges and help them roll away from us in space, because it is not a cut out image of a vase. It is a vase in three-dimensional form. I'm also putting an additional coat of now cobalt blue and the raw umber in these darker parts of the painting. Blue, being cooler, does sit back in space a bit more. It is because we usually see the world in yellow sunlight, and so we are just accustomed, theoretically, to assuming cooler things are farther away, as well as the bluish particles in the air that separate, well, they sort of create a blue screen between us and distant objects like mountains. So more than one reason why things are seen that way. So the blue and the raw umber are pushing things back. This isn't looking darker because the paint is wet. Oil paint dries true to the way that it's painted. Okay, it doesn't even dry. It solidifies true to the way that it's painted. So this is actually that much darker. The other thing is, with each subsequent glaze layer, we put more pigments in the oil. So less light is able to reflect back out from the white canvas underneath, and also less light is refracting on the surface because this is not matte, it is shiny. The oil makes it shiny. Okay, matte things can only it refracts light, it sends it off in many different directions, whereas oil surfaces, they reflect light, creating an opportunity for wavelengths of photons to bounce back through the pigments, and we just see things as lighter and brighter when they are reflective. So that pushes the space back, and then I can pull some of that very dark color again onto the edges of this vase or jug to push things back a little further. Okay, and yes, so you can kind of like push things back where things are already dark, like if you just need an area to separate, like you don't want, like I don't want the back leg of this stand that holds up the crystal ball to look like it's flying in the air. I want it to look like it's moving backwards in space. So I'm going to add a little bit more of that dark color on it. And I can push some of the things in here back without losing the detail. And if there's too much and you don't like it, you can try this trick at home. You will need a little bit of turpentine, and you'll just have a little sip in your tiny sock mouth. Now we are going to fix this brown eye that shall tell you it is. So now you can just rub the area where you want to pick up some of your brunei. If it's just like not working for you, like if you feel like, oh, too much there, or, I'm sorry, not your brunei, but your actual glaze that you just laid on. You can be like, ah, I don't like that. So that's a tool you can use. I am not a tool. I am a French sock. And the word is Versailles and Sauvage. And what else did you mispronounce? Everything. Okay, thanks, sock guy. You're the best. Okay, so Yeah, so again, you can sort of stipple paint in different areas. If you want to bring some of this into your painting and push it back a bit. Something you should know is that details are seen the most actually in the mid-range of values in your painting, and they aren't seen as well in shadows or in light areas. So if you are trying to realistically convey the texture of something, you don't need to do it all over. Actually, that's not how you would see it. That'll look like strange, like a stamp or a projection or something. Okay, so there's that. Okay. And here is an image of the serrage work. And this is the wax. Serrage. Okay, so you can use stippling to tie things into the background and also to just like soften edges. And this paint is still wet. So it becomes the wet on wet technique when, okay, I've got something wet on the canvas and I like the way it looks, but now I want to enhance like the form of this jug further. What can I do? Well, I'm going to use a little bit of cadmium yellow with the raw umber to create something warmer that will advance a little more. Mix it with some of my linseed stand oil to get a nice yellow glaze color, and the painting is still wet, so really want this bulge of the form in the center here to advance towards us. And then I know that this like little lip up here also advances towards us, and can lay some over this handle, some of the warmer color over the handle, bring it towards us. Okay, so now in some of the areas where I had the blue and raw umber, it will kind of get to a point where it's going to meet the yellow, and that is where the life of the wet on wet painting is born, where the wet colors are mixed together directly on the surface of the image. Okay, you see it looks very round the way that it all gets pulled away on the sides, and I can push back some of this part of this other cast bronze chick and push her back on this side as well. Okay, but again, you don't lose the form and the details of the object. Like, and I definitely don't want her to look like she's at all in any way in front of the handle of this jug, so I'm going to push that part back. And so you can be kind of like fearless about your application of the glaze colors, because you can wipe them off if you don't like what you did. It's like what you would tell your best friend when you were 13, like, please let me do your makeup. If you don't like it, you could just wash it off. She would say no, and you'd be like, why? You can just wash it off. But anyway, yeah, you can just wipe it away if you don't like it. And the other thing is that you can put all of your careful hard work into that Camaieu underpainting. You know, it's basically, it should be like a black and white drawing. It should be exactly the way you want the image to look, but in black and white. Like, your black and white range and description should be so good that you don't even know if you need to put glazes of color on it, because like it should be communicated in the value and the light, optically, the time of day, like the time of day, you can register that. I mean, the weather, you can even get a sense of the season in a black and white painting. This is April. This is Zurich in April. Okay, so be fearless and be dramatic when you're pushing back. This is like actually my life lesson speech. Just be fearless and dramatic all the time. But yeah, the more dramatic you are with the glazing, the more like depth and form you're going to get. You're going to eventually arrive at that like really fantastic, like how is it done kind of thing. Okay, and you don't need to be scared because you've already done the hard work, and the hard work won't wipe off with the glazes if you like change your mind about the way that you did something. Okay, so wet on wet. Okay, so impasto paint can be applied at any time, but its strata placement needs to be considered in the strata theory called fat over lean. If it needs to be more oily than the layers underneath, you will need to add a material like cold wax to give body and adhesion to the paint texture. So if you are putting your impasto on the very last layer of your paint, you need the surface to still be wet, and then you can actually adhere the thicker paint in with the rest of the oil rather than having it be like almost like a little sticker adhered on the surface, because you'll get more of a cohesion of the oil than an adhesion at that point. So now I'm going to use a little bit of titanium white. It's the strongest white. It's going on a layer of oil and glaze here that is quite wet and is quite oily. I put a lot of oil medium in it. I used a lot of linseed stand oil so that it would be transparent. And I didn't put any additional cobalt dryer in it. It's not going to dry super quick. You don't want the last surface to dry super quick because just like the earth, when you have a lot of rain and then you have a drought, the earth cracks because the surface is drier than what's underneath it, and it's shrinking as it's drying and forming, and it contracts. Same thing with the oil. When the oil cures and solidifies, it contracts, and if the stuff on the top dries before the stuff underneath of it, you're going to have the cracks. But if the stuff underneath of it gets a chance to dry first, and the stuff on the top stays very oily, then it shouldn't crack, in theory. But I won't be alive 400 years from now to let you know if my painting has cracked or not. You'll have to do that for me. The internet is eternal, so I believe somebody will watch this 400 years from now and be like, wow, this girl really had no idea how to use her equipment. And I'll be like in my grave rolling over. Just kidding. Okay, so I put a little cold wax medium here with this titanium white. So now you can see it's like a delicious pastry. Oh, come on. It's like that filling in a fancy Italian pastry. Okay, so I'm gonna put some of this just in a few little places on this, like the edges of a few things here. I want it to have some like body to it, right? Because it's impasto. And I'm putting it where there's wet oil paint because I want it to here to the other paint. And if it's like getting messy, you can use a brush. Just be aware that if it gets mixed in with your glaze layer, you can create a foggy effect. And that can be an effect that you're really going for. Like in this painting, you can see some of this like foggy, misty business. And that is a white glazed on top of other darker colors. So that's a lighter color on top of a darker, and it creates a misty effect, but it also really kills the chroma of the painting, and it doesn't have a lot of luminosity because white paint is opaque, and so not a lot of light is passing through it. So it's not going to be like a super bright white, like white on white. Okay, so you can kind of see here where some of that titanium white got into the glaze, and it has sort of graded out. So I'm just going to try to get some of it off. I need my French sock. A croissant was the pastry I believe you had in mind. No, I really don't think it was a croissant. Like, they don't have like fluffy white icing. I do not ask your opinion. Oh my gosh. I feel like you're the Wilson for me in Castaway, and I still have a parrot. You're welcome. Okay. So that's great. So thank you very much for that. French man. French sock man. Okay. Quarantine, dude. Start making puppets. Anyway, so that is how you add impasto paint. You actually can glaze over the impasto paint, and the glaze, the pigments in the glaze, they're going to separate over the rough surface, and they're going to sink in to the trenches of the mark that you made. This is going to give it a dirty effect, which might be what you want. If you're trying to show, you know, you're doing the cover of Old Man and the Sea, and you really need the old man's beard to be like dirty looking, you can glaze over a texture, and it will really pick up, like I said, the crests and troughs of your mark. So you can spray Damar varnish between the layers of glazes. Okay, and if you need to return to a layer that's like drying or is becoming solid, you can rub some stand oil onto the surface, and you can blend it with a soft feathery brush. So linseed stand oil. Again, stand oil is made from linseed oil. It is heated until it goes through polymerization, and basically that makes it thicker. Okay, so you can rub a little bit of that into the surface, and it will become a little bit more malleable again, so you can do more wet on wet work. Okay, so like I said, use ambient occlusion to enhance the form of objects, allow the distant edges and contours to take on the similar quality to the ground, go for cooler colors to push them back, warmer colors will pull them forward. And objects in the foreground and focal point, they can be blocked in with that intense mid-tone, and then while the paint is still wet, you'll be able to go in and make further changes to your painting. So I'm going to put a little bit more of this brighter yellow or green here. I don't want it to look too yellow, so I just want to make sure that these are really jumping out of this. Okay, so it's like got unity in its color while it doesn't necessarily look too flat. Okay, so you can also push objects back in space by dulling the chroma with a complementary hue. So complementary to the Brunei is going to be like indigo, phthalo blue, and turquoise, but turquoise kind of pops. So let's try a little bit of indigo. Okay, indigo, Series 2, still pretty inexpensive paint and quite translucent. So your glazes are definitely going to work better if you're using translucent paint. Really, the opaque paint is only for like laying on the wet final surface, because it's just not going to allow a lot of light through, so all you can expect it to do is be the color that it is. It doesn't really blend well or anything. So I need to take some of this muddy linseed stand oil off of my nice smooth soft synthetic brush. So turpentine, just the tiniest little bit. Keep it in a glass because it will corrode plastics. Okay, just rinsing off all the oils and things so that we can have some control over the color. Okay, so indigo, I do want it to be a glaze. I want it to be translucent, so I'm adding more of the oil to the paint. Oh, oops. You can also use your newsprint to just like dab some of your oil and paint off if you need to. Okay, so okay. This is very dramatic. This is really giving it so much depth. It's like I actually feel as though I need to be careful of how much of it gets onto the sides of the objects because it is pulling them back so much. So we know that when the brain looks at a color for a very long time, eventually it will kind of get bored or burn out of looking at one kind of color. Okay, your sensors in your retina, they get kind of lazy, and that's when it's called burnout. So if you look directly into the sun and you get a burn in your eye, it's because you are burning the sensors in your retina. So when you look at red, 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 red for quite a while, like if you stare at like a bright kind of plastic in the sun, and it burns out a spot in your retina and you look away from it, you'll see the opposite color in that little patch where you had been staring, in that little patch in your retina. So, and it compensates, it starts firing, like your red sensors aren't working anymore, and it's mostly like the complementary sensors that start firing. So when you layer a complementary color over the other, the kinds of light waves that can bounce back through that are getting pretty limited. So the more, and the other thing is, again, once again, the more pigments on the surface, the less light can pass through them and reflect or refract, either one. It's just less light coming back out. And every time you put a darker layer on your background, your objects are going to advance more and more. So if you feel like, oh my goodness, my person back here that's a part of the stand is like really so lost in the painting, it's like she's just completely disappearing into the shadows, you can push your darks in those shadowed areas back and they will help bring things forward without the actual thing looking like it's moving forward beyond the foreground objects. So hopefully that clicked for you at some point in this demo. That just because you're pushing these objects forward, you're not changing these in their relationship to this, and so this will still sit in front of these no matter how dark the background gets. Okay, so I don't want my edges to be too sharp because these are not paper cutout people. They are real people standing in front of us in the painting. Ce n'est pas une personne. So yeah, so I'm going to just like soften all the edges with a little bit of dry brushing here. That's all I'm doing. I want to tie edges of forms into the background a bit so that they will recede somewhat, especially on the further away spaces and objects. If you put zinc white over top of flesh tones, it puts this haze over them that is pretty much like Vaseline on a camera lens or camera eye. And it just gives it this softness. And if you have like these multiple layers of blues and reds and yellows in the skin that like reflect the actual temperatures of different parts of the face, and you put this white haze over it, it makes them very subtle. And if you've kept all your layers very thin, a lot of light should bounce back out of it. So it becomes this mysterious, multi-hued image where the white isn't actually describing like a lighter area. It's describing, it's not describing anything. It's actually obscuring a lot. And so yeah, again, this is like the time for wet on wet paint. So back here, I really want this part of the body to recede a lot more than it is. Just kind of want it to disappear. I don't really need any information about how it's receding over there. Then I want the neck to look more round. And I want this to be deeper, this like side of the collarbone. Okay, and you can see I painted some little streaks of like chest hairs, ew, on this portrait, and even if you glaze over them, you don't lose them. So if you develop like some form and you add like a texture or a descriptive mark to the surface and you're like, oh no, it's perfect, except that its value isn't right, and so my form looks flat, you can actually probably leave it alone as long as it's not too bad, and you can use glazes to adjust the value, the chroma, and the hue of the area. So you can make a lot of adjustments with this. And you can make very dramatic adjustments as well. So if you're working on some part like this here again, I used one of the umbers. I think it's raw umber. So you're going to refer to that really great color chart that you'll find in the manual that I will probably finally have time to like publish this year. Oh, paint pigments in a color wheel. So raw umber, indigo is going to be a great complement for it. It's like an accurate color wheel. So loaded up some indigo and just want to push maybe some of the beard down a bit. I'd like it to look a little bit more like a beard with its own shadow on it. And we can also like sort of push some of the waves of the hair to make them have a little more form and appear much less flat. You could see it's really helping to give the hair a lot more texture. And like here I want the hair to look like it sort of tucks into the head, and here I want it to advance, so more indigo where I want it to go back and leave more of the raw umber showing where I want it to advance. So many tones, and like I said a bazillion times now, painting over marks doesn't make them go away with glazing because the paint is transparent. So if you get like half of the hair texture done in your Camaieu, Grisaille or Brunei, whatever color you're using for your project, you can add more information to the texture when you get to glazing without losing the texture that you already put there. So it just really like further complicates it even. So now, if you like the way that is looking in the hair, you can come back with another tool of your choice and you can scratch some of that glaze off, and you will get like the finest little hairs ever onto the surface. Get in that eyebrow. These impossibly fine marks with this impossibly textured like minute detail in the hair. That's the stuff that you get when you glaze, my dear. Now, maybe you've practiced in acrylics a lot and you're like, why should I make the jump to oils? Because you can't glaze in acrylics. You also, in acrylics, paint doesn't dry true to the color that it's painted in. When it dries, it's a lighter color. So it's harder to work on at another time, and it would be impossible to glaze with a color changing paint like that. The linseed oil medium will yellow over time, and like I said, that can be removed from the surface of a painting, but you'll probably be dead by the time it's yellow, so don't even worry about it. And yeah, the other thing with acrylics, okay, they don't dry true to their color, you can't glaze with them, and you also Oh shoot, I'm sorry, I can't remember what the third thing was. Oh, you can't paint wet on wet. Sorry, that took me a long time to remember. You can't paint wet on wet with the acrylics. They dry too fast. So, y'all. So also for this painting, I have the multiple glazes on the face with the different hues. And now I'm using the cold wax medium and the titanium white. And I'm just gonna put a little bit of, well, a tiny bit of sparkle. A little sparkle. I actually think that's too much sparkle. I know, unbelievable, too much sparkle. Okay, yeah, we'll just, yeah, there, perfect. Okay, fun, right? So fun. Oil painting just got so much more fun for you. It's not like other painting. It's more fun. More fun. Okay. Whew. Still practicing. Okay, great job tuning in today and doing something for yourself as a creative. I'll see you in the next episode.